Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Renaissance and Reformation course. And we're now entering into the Reformation proper. And today we're going to talk about Martin Luther. And of all sort of coincidences, remember there's a little incident where Martin Luther is walled up in the Wartburg, and he goes incognito by growing a beard. So I'm feeling some strange affinity for Martin Luther right now. But no, in all seriousness, I've actually always felt this weird affinity for Martin Luther. I don't think personality-wise, but in terms of his stance against authority, although he ultimately does create a different kind of authority, his stand against the large, corrupt administration, his wanting to change things to become more personal and direct. And I think that for some reason I've always kind of gotten that in a way that I can certainly respect and understand Calvin. He's a cold and forbidding figure. I think Martin Luther, I could probably have sat down with him and had a beer and enjoyed his company, even though he does get kind of tiresome if you read everything that Luther's written. And on that note, I should mention, before we say anything about these two towering figures of the Protestant Reformation, there's a little quip by Isaiah Berlin that I remember my own advisor talking about in a class in grad school, where he mentioned that if you were comparing these two figures, Martin Luther is a hedgehog, bear with me, and Calvin is a fox. Now by that, he meant that Martin Luther comes back to the same topic over and over and over, and he really only has one major thing to say. There were a lot of things that he just didn't really think were so important, and we'll discuss whether those are or not, according to other people. So he's like a hedgehog, that he just kind of roots around, stays in one small place, and says the same thing over and over. And he can be vicious at times. There are things he did that are not very admirable in some respects, but he's like a little furry hedgehog. Okay, Calvin the fox is all over the place at all times. He's running, he's crafty, he's very smart. He's very interesting to read as a theologian, and even as an anthropologist. I've always been struck every time I read the Institutes of the Christian Religion and Calvin starts talking about why people need religion or why it's happened historically. I think this is a remarkably sophisticated mind at play here, even though, again, he did lots of very strange things to our mind. But Luther is kind of more, how should I say, down to earth, ordinary, and plain speaking in many respects, and you'll understand why that's very important in just a moment. So for the rest of the course, of course, we're going to be talking about the Reformation, which is one of the most important events in European history, and in fact in world history, if you think of it that way, that separates the Middle Ages from the modern era. We spoke about all the demographic shift and economic change. We talked about the discovery of the New World. Well, Luther's definitely the third thing. This is the split, not just into two parts of Western Christendom. Of course, there's always been a split between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the papacy, but the split within Europe, and sometimes within various countries themselves, between Catholicism, we can use that term now properly, and many, many other sects of Protestantism, not just Lutherans, but Zwingli, the Swiss Reform, starting with Zwingli and then Calvin, the English Church, the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the Dutch Reform, the Anabaptists. There's many, many different sects. And as you know, that trend kind of continues right down to the present. So we have Baptists and Methodists and Seventh-day Adventists and Church of Latter-day Saints and many, many different sects. Christianity, of course, separates into many different separate denominations. They are all Christian, except maybe the Mormons, if you trust some people, but they all believe in Jesus. This is something that I'm amazed sometimes. I'm teaching Western Civ, and someone doesn't quite understand, thinking Christian is different from Catholic. Well, Catholicism is one type of Christianity, and so is the Lutheran Church. So is the the Calvinist churches, which we'll talk about. So just let me mention that, just in case gets confusing to you. There's Christianity, which branches into the West and the Eastern Orthodox, and the Eastern Orthodox includes the Greek Orthodox to start with, Russian Orthodox, Ethiopian, the Coptic Church in Egypt, the Bulgarian Church. I mean, many different churches there that are separate, different rites, slightly different rites. And then the Western Church, there's only one until this point, and that then splinters into Lutherans and Calvinists, which do not get along. The Calvinists split, they don't split, but they form into separate groups that are the Huguenots in France, that are the Presbyterians in Scotland, that are the Dutch Reform, that are the Swiss in Geneva, that are the Puritans in Massachusetts are Calvinists also, and even in the English Church goes very Puritan for quite a long time. And then there are other branches of the English Church that break away in the course of the English Revolution, where we get Baptists and Quakers and Shakers and Seekers and Ranters and then of course the 18th century Methodists. So it's a long, very fascinating history. If I could paint you a family tree now of Christianity, but the point I want to really make is they are all Christian, but they're different denominations. And I think it kind of odd and weird that I'm posting this lecture on Good Friday, I guess. Today's Thursday, but I'm going to post it tomorrow. And the point also is that all of these churches, the very understanding of religion gets transformed in this period, including Catholicism, changes in the Catholic Reformation to a very different understanding of what that means. Not only from, as I mentioned last time, from practices, the rituals and the pilgrimages and the adoration of relics, to beliefs and creeds, but I would say also a different direct understanding of the connection between the individual and God. And I'm going to go into much greater detail about this in a moment. I think that's a very important thing, that before it was entirely a communal act. Of course, you did things as an individual, but your worship was communal and ritual, and then really nothing personal. After this, it becomes your connection directly to God. And I want you to understand that's a threat to the institution of the Catholic Church, where everything is about communal ritual and profit. Just to be not being facetious about that. If someone has a direct line to God, doesn't mean they can be saved, but if their main form of worship is through private devotion, what do you need the priests for? What do you need the church for, or the Pope, or anything? That's the major issue here. Okay, we'll see how it gets resolved. It's really kind of fascinating, and in some cases, surprising. So the question, which obviously is going through your mind now, is why is Luther so important? Why was he the first? Why was he the first successful person to break away from the Catholic Church? And this has more to do with politics than anything. There are many movements that anticipate Luther, and I want to just mention those because I kind of left them out of the larger discussion last time when I was talking about late medieval Christianity, because they're not really mainstream, but they do in many ways anticipate some of the things Luther is going to promote. So I want you to just keep in your mind the Babylonian captivity, the state of the papacy with those fun-loving or warrior popes or whatever they were, and keep in mind also not just the anti-clerical sentiment against the ignorance of priests and concubinage and simony, buying positions, and nepotism, giving positions to your children, which priests shouldn't have children, of course. And the general wealth of the church, which struck people as very strange. That comes to an apogee right at the moment that Luther is visits Rome, in fact, and sees what's happening, and sees St. Peter going up. And we'll talk about whether that was really worth it in the long run, but a very important moment there. I want to remind you of that, and I want to remind you of the intellectual ferment that's happening with the Erasmians and their anti-clericalism, and this idea that the religion should be designed to help people lead better lives, perform good deeds, become righteous, and ultimately be saved. Salvation is the key here. What do you do to get saved, to go to heaven? Is it the relics and the saints and the pilgrimages and the works and the what Erasmus, of course, called superstition that wasn't in the New Testament, the stuff that accrued over centuries, and in some cases is sort of pagan, Stop and think about Easter as we're about to enter into it. Easter, Astarte, she's a pagan goddess, and the whole fertility cult with the Easter eggs, and well, it's a tradition in Christianity, of course, by this point, but its roots are pagan, totally, So that we'll see, that'll be a part, not in Erasmus so much, but when we get to other Protestant sects, they want to get rid of that stuff. If it's not in the New Testament, they don't want to do it, and if it is there, they do. That's another very important point we'll get to. But the other thing that I did not really mention, apart from the anti-clericalism, is the growth of lay piety, and I want to discuss that in a little more detail. I mentioned Thomas à Kempis briefly, which was the Imitation of Christ, a little devotional book, but it goes much beyond that, and it's a form of devotion that takes place outside the authority of the church and of its strictures. Now, it doesn't replace the sacraments. Of course, you still need the sacraments to be saved, but it's kind of a private religion that people take on their own volition that goes through irregular channels that circumvent the authority and the hierarchy and the money-making, establishment that is the church. And the fact that people not only gathered, it's called the Devotio Moderna, incidentally, called the modern devotion at the time. The fact that people would gather in these lay confraternities, and when I use the word fraternity, sometimes they actually are basically frat houses. Boys get together and they drink and give money and and it serves a kind of welfare system sometimes too. But they're often guild halls. Will have a chapel connected to them. But a lay confraternity, sometimes they become quite powerful. They will build their own little churches. They will have prayer readings, which is sort of unusual. It requires obviously literacy, but the fact that they're getting together and talking about religiosity that is not part of the standard liturgy is kind of new. That's hence Devotio Moderna. And many of these had a school attached, okay? Meaning that they thought their children should be raised not just with the pagan ethics, but with Christian morality, right? That comes out of the text of the Bible, because presumably they didn't think the church was doing it, right? So they're just taking it in their own hands and doing it. And the most famous of these, let me mention, it's called the Brethren of the Common Life, which is a kind of school. It's kind of like a catechism, you go to a church school, and it teaches you not the basics like, grammar and math and things like that, but it teaches you basic morality and understanding of religion, but it is an actual school. So it's more like a Catholic school, if you want to think of it that way, but toward this kind of private devotion. Now, the reason I mention this is Erasmus, I'm pretty sure, went to one of these schools, and I'm pretty sure Luther did also. And that's the weird connection between these two figures, right? Is this private devotion. And let's just also say sometimes it moves toward mysticism, not necessarily in that school, but in other forms. It moves toward a kind of inner religion. This experience of personal, direct means of access to God through revelation. And of course, that's all through the Old Testament and New Testament. And through the Middle Ages, people would have direct access. Saints don't have intercessors or anyone. And that the assumption is that the mediation of the church, it's not superfluous, but it's not the main connection you have to spirituality. And it's not that you don't need those rituals, but devotion, being devout, is a thing that you choose as an individual and you work toward, and you do, private exercises, prayers, that are beyond the mass. Okay, that's the idea. And of course, the Catholic Church always maintains rigorously that there could be no salvation outside the church. Without the sacraments, without the priests, you cannot be saved. These rituals are necessary, so people will still do them, right? But this is kind of extra and added on and strangely personal, because you're doing it privately with this beautiful little prayer book, or with, your own private chapel in your house, or, you can't think on your own in any, sense. Only the church promulgates dogma. Only the church and its hierarchy can interpret theology, and only they can interpret the Bible. That's a very important thing. Remember, ordinary people are not encouraged to read the Bible at all. A private person is required to accept its pronouncements without questions. So this is not theological speculation. I mean, oddly, ironically, that happens in the universities. That happens among the scholastic theologians. They're allowed to speculate in Latin privately as a matter of just theological discourse and disputation. Private people, absolutely not. So they developed this weird kind of private devotional practice, not questioning official dogma, but strengthening yourself. And anyone who actually espouses heretical ideas is going to come before the Inquisition or the religious authorities and be burnt if they don't recant. So I just want to make clear, this is not at all about speculation, theological speculation. And let me also mention that this connection to the heretical groups that I was talking about, I mentioned the Albigensians. There are also the Waldensians, the followers of Waldo, who they could never seem to find the guy. They kept wondering, where's Waldo? But no. The Illuminati or Alumbrados in Spain, or another one of these, have a direct kind of mystical connection to God, and they usually have a charismatic leader who takes them, and sometimes they do criticize the church, and sometimes they are soundly persecuted for all of this. But two groups in particular I want to mention, because those other mystical groups are really very medieval, so we're not going to talk about them anymore. But two are kind of, we might even think of them as kind of temporarily stalled reformations, or nascent proto-reformations, or something like that. Because they come up with a lot of the similar ideas that later reformers do, and in fact, very similar to Luther in many respects. So let me mention two of these specifically, who I'd really like you to know. One is the English theologian John Wycliffe, Wyclif. That's the late 14th century, so we're going back pretty far. Who suggested that the church shouldn't be so wealthy. And we've heard that before. Who suggested that clerical abuses should be eradicated. We've heard that. That's typical talk by this point. But most importantly, his contention that the Word, the Bible itself, was a guide for everyday worship and practice and dogma and the liturgy, and we should use the Bible itself as a guide for whatever we do in terms of religion, in terms of the service that we do in the church, and how the church should be modeled after the Bible, rather than all these traditions that have accrued over the centuries. And it should be, and here's the real kicker, the ultimate authority, not the Pope. The suggestion, of course, is that the Pope is fallible. The Pope and the traditions are kind of added on later, but if we're wondering, what do we do, this kind of thing or that kind of thing, use the text of the Bible as the authority, the ultimate authority. The papacy, of course, is a human institution. It's fallible. It does make mistakes, as everyone knows. All humans make mistakes. The Bible, however, was considered the Word of God. Or if written by humans, they were directly inspired by God, right? Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and all the other books of the New Testament. So we know they were written by people, but their inspiration was through direct contact, in the case of the Synoptic Gospels, or later by divine inspiration, is that those should not be considered traditions. Those are the Testament, the book itself, the Word of God, which Jesus says, "Here, I am the Word, here's the Word," and that is taken to mean the Bible. So that is a very, very dangerous idea. Now, why the Bible put in everyone's hands? Let them read it. It's a very, I won't say it's a confusing book, but there's so many different hands involved in writing that thing. Not even just the Old Testament, which has, hundreds of different authors and spans centuries and centuries of writing, that there's contradictions in it, right? And even in the New Testament, which is only written in the course of 150 years or so after Jesus' death, there's different authors, different intentions, different purposes for writing. The four Gospels are different from Paul's letters, which are different from the book of Revelations by John. At the end, they're all very different. So what happens if you put that in someone's hands? Does that open a remarkable sphere of speculation? Does it open the door to confusion? Of course it does, right? It's not a clear book. It's not like, say, the Quran, which is written by Muhammad's following, and it's all his words that come directly in. It's very easy to follow. It says, do this, don't do that, do that. The Bible is stories and parables, and it's not as direct and clear to read, let alone the Old Testament. It's really difficult. Lists of kings for pages and pages. But you understand what I mean. Is that the question also is that if something is not found in the text of the Bible, should we be doing it anyway? If something is not found in the New Testament, do we then go to the Old Testament, which is we'll see, will be a very thorny question, and people make some questionable decisions based on that criteria. So Wycliffe, actually got away with his neck, okay, espousing these ideas, mostly in Oxford, I think. I'm pretty sure it was Oxford, in a university setting. He was protected by a few noble friends and never was persecuted, but his followers, the people called the Lollards, and that word means to mumble. The Lollards were persecuted in the 15th century, and actually Wycliffe himself was posthumously convicted of heresy. His bones were dug up and they were burned. I mentioned the Lollards because there's this very interesting speculation in English tradition that the Lollards they were persecuted under, I guess it's Henry V. In fact, if you know the Henry IV books, Falstaff is supposed to be modeled on John Oldcastle, who was a Lollard, although that's really not in Shakespeare's plays at all. But in any case, the Lollards maybe went underground and then rose up again when we get to the 16th century and become the Puritans. Geographically, it kind of makes sense. It's weird. The places where Lollardy was the strongest, East Anglia especially, were places where the Puritan movement becomes especially strong. And this connection, I'm just rambling here, but the connection to New England is direct. If you look at the houses that are in East Anglia, the wooden clapboard houses, they look like the ones you see in Boston. The accent, Harvard Yard, that's what they speak in East Anglia. So there is some truth to the idea that Lollards and the kind of radical people that were in these pockets, not just in East Anglia, elsewhere also, kind of rise up in the Reformation later and become real Protestants. So that's one failed Reformation. Another one is maybe even more interesting, takes place in Bohemia. So I'm talking about what's now Czechia, the Czech Republic, led by a guy named Jan Hus, H-U-S. And Hus is, I won't say he's more sophisticated than Wycliffe, but he anticipates far more of what Luther is going to say, specifically in his criticism of indulgences. And that's the key issue we'll talk about in just a second. But he took his complaints about the Eucharist, the fact, remember, they were only getting the bread and not the wine too. He said, receiving the sacrament in one kind is really not delivering it. He took that idea to the Council of Constance in 1415. This is in Switzerland. And he was charged with heresy, and he was burned there for not recanting. He thought everyone should get both. In days of quarantine, we can understand why they didn't give everyone wine out of the same cup. Maybe they could have used little cup. I don't know. I'm just saying that theologically that was his issue. And Huss, even though he was burned, some of his followers survived. They are called Hussites, and there is a direct connection between those surviving Hussites in the 15th century and the movements of brethren in Bohemia later who become Protestants. That's for sure direct. There is a Reformed church that actually springs up there in the 16th century, which we'll get to. Very important. So the question which most people really wonder is, why did these two earlier movements fail, and why did Lutherans succeed? What was different about this? What happened here? What factors were most important in Luther's succeeding? And the point I want to make most strongly, and please put a big star next to this in your notes, is those other movements, at least at the popular level, really didn't have official backing. They never had powerful people in the long run to protect them. Luther and the Lutheran Reformation ultimately is a state Reformation. It's a magisterial Reformation. That's the term they use, meaning it's put in by magistrates. It has the backing of powerful princes who basically wanted to be free from Rome for political reasons and wanted to be independent of the empire for political reasons. So the Reformation kind of happens with their power because they protect Luther and because they implement the Reformation and they squash the popular expression of the Reformation, which we'll talk about when we get to the Radical Reformation. And so it is an official movement, but supported by the state, not just a groundswell of popular, piety and anti-clericalism. And if Luther had not been protected by the Elector of Saxony, he would have been burned, like Jan Hus, no doubt about that. So it's popular backing. And I think the other factor, and I'm going to make a big point of this, is the printing press, is the role of mass communication in reaching people and convincing them, of spreading the word faster, of convincing people quicker. Wait a minute, that indulgence I just bought, that's not going to get me in heaven. And literacy, of course, connected to the printing press, is that by the time Luther's writing, the printing press isn't just cranking out big Latin Bibles like Gutenberg. There's a popular press. There's popular devotional works, like I mentioned. There's tracts, there's pamphlets, there's things that are posted on walls that can be cranked out by the thousands because of the movable type. It's not just printing itself. It's the fact that you can take the letters, move them in your case, hoping you don't get your P's and Q's mixed up, right? And then print out thousands of a pamphlet or a book or a poster, a broadsheet that you just post somewhere. That is absolutely essential. And again, the printing press, think back to when we were talking about communications revolutions, the one that we've lived through. And I think weirdly, we're going to live through it. The very fact that I'm talking to you through my phone and videoing it tells you we are about to have another another iteration of our revolution in communications. Luther's happening right at that time. Not at the beginning of printing, like we're not at the beginning of personal computers and online whatever, but something spurs it into another phase as Luther is writing, and the same thing's happening now. We're being spurred into another phase of teaching, right? And the other thing to really emphasize here is Luther appears in a moment of widespread social unrest. Think back to the 16th century demographic rise, the polarization of wealth, the depecoration, the fact that they're not eating so much meat or drinking as much, A whole lot of poor people perceive that the wealthy church is an agent of oppression. And again, judging that is really hard to do because a lot of people are still giving money and believing it, and the church is very popular in many respects. But I think the social problems exacerbate those revolutionarily minded to say, wait a minute, why is the church so wealthy? Why are we giving so much money to them when we don't have enough food on the table? So social unrest, we'll see, is a part of why this happened, even though it's squashed in the end. So again, I'll get to that. So anti-clericalism, reaches its peak in the early 16th century, and what appeared to many people to be a church thoroughly rotten to its core. Some people did believe that, no doubt. And again, whether that's the important issue or the new theology is an important issue, we'll try to weave them all together. I think they're all very central. So let's get to the point. Let's talk about Luther and Luther himself. He was born in 1483, so he's right where we are on the course, more or less. He was sent to a Brethren of Common Life school. Okay, I got that right. So in Eisenach, that is influenced by the whole lay piety movement. That's even influenced by Erasmus at this point. Okay, he was sent off from there to the University of Erfurt, and the kind of education he would have gotten at Erfurt would have been scholastic, Aristotelian, based on Thomas Aquinas and Occam and Abelard, and all sorts of medieval theologians. He would have gotten a standard theology training there, not a humanist training, okay, and not perfect Latin, classical Latin, any of that stuff. So his mindset is, at least from the start, at least what's being thrown down his throat is the medieval mainstream, okay? And not unexpectedly, Luther ended up being an Augustinian friar. Now, monasticism, again, comes in many, many different forms. The common perception was that monks were not living terribly austere lives of permanent penance and whipping themselves like the flagellants, or starving themselves, or taking vows of silence and poverty. And there were people doing that, but the mainstream, the Augustinians, I think, were fairly worldly, right? They had a lot of wealth. Their monasteries were often landowners. That's something I should mention, is even though sometimes a monastic order is not allowed to have personal property, the monastery itself can own land and have tenants. And this happens because people will put younger children into the monastery and then, or donate money when they die to a monastic order, or land. So many monastic orders are very wealthy. And that's actually why so many of them break off into other more austere orders, right? But the Augustinians are one of the older ones, and they are mostly theologians, scholastic kind of theologians. And to remind you of what monastic life is like, remember you have to say the Mass many times during the day, at very specific hours, several times through the day and night, so you don't get a good night's sleep. I think that's part of this whole thing. And a whole lot of rituals, and a whole lot of praying, and some orders do work also, like the Cistercians will run wineries and so forth. I don't think the Augustinians do. I think their teaching is their main job. Sometimes there are rigorous spiritual duties. Sometimes they will fast for a long period. Certainly during Lent, they're not eating meat, or some will actually give up alcohol also, which is sort of interesting. Not for the Eucharist, not for the communion, Mass, but and sometimes they will. I would say some are into self-torture, and I don't know how else to say this. Is the the self-inflicted physical punishment. Think about what it's like when you get a haircut, and someone chops off your hair. We all need a haircut now, and there's hairs on the back of your neck, and they start to itch. and it's really kind of uncomfortable because they kind of, prickle into your skin. Many monks wore a hair shirt underneath their clothes intentionally to feel uncomfortable, to punish themselves. The silice or silice, I'm not sure how you pronounce that word, but it's a kind of clamp you put around your leg that gives you pain all the time. Every step you take, it kind of digs into your leg. It's made of metal. Other ways to make your life really unpleasant and uncomfortable as an act of devotion. The more you suffer physically, the more you become spiritually strong. Is the idea. This is a spiritual exercise in a weird way that is denying your body. You're not allowed to kill yourself. Obviously, you can't deny yourself food and sustenance and everything, but you can push yourself to the brink of a kind of heroic asceticism, sort of ecstatic self destruction, almost to the point. The idea is that you subdue the body, you strengthen the soul, and that's of course a tradition in Western Christianity. This asceticism, askete means exercise, actually, from Greek. And these exercises, the more you do of them, the more prayers you repeat, the more masses you say, the better. Remember, these are considered good works. Right? The monastic orders pray for the souls of everyone else. So that's their job, to say masses for the dead, to go through the rituals. And it doesn't matter if there's a congregation there or not. In fact, often there isn't. They're private. Now, I don't think Luther was one of these extreme ascetics, and you'll see why I say that in a moment. But it's part of the tradition of monasticism, as well as, of course, celibacy. Right? Because you're a priest. You take holy orders. And although you don't administer directly to a congregation like a priest would, you are part of this community of like-minded brothers who refer to themselves as brothers. And of course, a woman can do this too. There's nunneries that are very similar. And they sometimes take in people as not full members of the order, but people who help them do work and cook sometimes and clean and do things like that. So it's not entirely cut off from the world at all. And remember, they own property, they go about and do things, but they live separately. They don't have families. They don't live within the community. They live communally in a monastery. And the stuff that they do, they believe, not only is for the good of the souls of everyone, you get personal credit for all this. All the stuff you do gets you into heaven. The more you can fast, the more you can subdue your body. Again, you can't harm yourself permanently, but you can do this stuff that makes you Christ-like. You can suffer like he did. You can, empathize with the wounds he had and the crucifixion, of course. But the idea is God is this, as I said last time, like a big accountant. He counts up your good works. Then you reach that magic number, and that gets you into heaven. That gets you saved. So you don't have to spend time in purgatory. Those good things, God likes that you do those. Okay, presumably, right? Even though it doesn't say that in the New Testament, it doesn't say anything about that, in fact. But very shortly thereafter, you have people like St. Anthony going out into the desert, or St. Simeon who goes up on a column for the rest of his life. So those works in God's account book are at the center of medieval Christianity, and even more so within monastic orders. And added to all these things, I should say, a pious donation also counts as a good work. And then the pilgrimages, the masses you say, the stuff that gets you, and I'm going to introduce this word here, justifies you. Now let's break down what that word means. Just means good. It makes you good. To be justified means that you are given grace, forgiveness, and you get into heaven. So the question is going to be, how do you get justified? It's not something you can do on your own. It's something that you have to do through these works, and some of it you do on your own. You could, helping grandma across the street does. But what is the means of being justified? When I use that term, very specific theological sense, what is it that you do that gets you into heaven? Okay, there's all this stuff. It gets you saved. It's an economic system of salvation, if you want to think of it that way. Is all the good works are counted up, and then you go to heaven. So, let's get back to Luther. There he is in this monastery doing all these things over and over and over again. And I have a feeling that Luther made a very bad monk. Okay, not only could he not stand staying up all night and saying the Mass over and over again and going through all this rigorous stuff, I think he just kept thinking, I keep failing at all this. I can't possibly become good. What I'm trying to do can't possibly be pleasing to God because I just stink at being a monk. And really, why does he want this anyway? Why does it make him happy if I sit in my little cell and say the Mass all on my own? What good does that do anyone? Maybe it's going to do good for me. Maybe if I say the Mass for someone else and they've given me money and it goes to the church, I mean, maybe that can do good things. But really, if I just say it on my own in my room, what good is that doing? If I wake up in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning and say the Mass and really feel like crap in the morning, why does God want me to do that? What could possibly be the purpose? And he began to have this kind of spiritual crisis where he thought, am I going to be saved at all? Because I keep failing at this stuff. He had this terrible feeling of guilt and worthlessness. That's kind of runs through his thought in a way that I don't get that impression from any other reformer. And he thought, whatever I do, it can't possibly be enough. What I'm doing can't please God because I keep messing up. So, in the middle of this spiritual crisis, or I guess it's part of it, he gets a chance to go to Rome, takes a trip there, and sees the papacy firsthand. He goes to the court of Leo X. So, remember, Leo was a Medici. All those painters are decorating his house, the Vatican. There's plans for a new St. Peter's, drawn up by Bramante, eventually fulfilled by people like Michelangelo and other architects. So he sees how much money is going into this admittedly beautiful artwork and the building of St. Peter's as a fabulous palace, as the largest, what it ends up being is the largest church on earth. I'm pretty sure it still is. Okay, I'm almost positive it is. Largest ecclesiastical building. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. But the question is, who's paying for all this stuff? Is all the money that's coming through the tithes that people pay not helping feed the poor, not going for instruction or teaching the clergy or maintaining the buildings or doing all this stuff, administrative stuff? Is it all getting funneled into the papacy so this guy can throw lovely parties and have paintings of pagan philosophers on the walls? Remember? I guess that's Julius II, but you get after him, but you get the idea. So the question is, how were they raising this money? And let me try and talk about this in detail. So there is something that it's called an indulgence. Okay? It's kind of like your bail bond to get out of purgatory, or the money that people are going to send you to get out. An indulgence is a physical piece of paper. Okay? And in fact, you can, if you're interested, go onto Google and just look for images of an indulgence. You can see one of these things. It's signed. They're actually eventually printed. So you print them out, some priest signs it, you pay for this. And what the indulgence does is, for a certain price, you get time out of purgatory, meaning you get saved. You get salvation by doing this good work. This is their logic, because you're giving money to the church, you're helping its mission. You get the piece of paper, the indulgence, that says that you will, it's a replacement for other things you can't do. Let's say you can't go on a pilgrimage because you've got a family to support and a business to maintain. You buy this indulgence, and that helps the work of the church. So it's not illogical at all. I mean, it does what it purports to do. but it also purports to gain you credit with God by getting you those brownie points that go into his big book of salvation. Now, the implication there, as you should see immediately, it means that if you're really, really wealthy, you can buy as many indulgences as you want. You can get any number of sins forgiven. And it means that wealthy people go to heaven and poor people don't, because they don't have the money to buy the indulgences. So I should mention, indulgences are the ones you'll read in any textbook. There are other things like them. A dispensation is, I think, in some ways just as interesting. A dispensation means, let's imagine it's Lent and I'm fasting, like now, and like Erasmus, who, poor Dutchman, could not stand fish. He couldn't eat it. The smell made him nauseous. And he purchased a dispensation from fasting so that he could eat meat during Lent. You can do that for medical reasons. You can do it if you're pregnant, if you're very old and sick. You can buy an indulgence, but also often a whole city would buy an indulgence. So like the town of Bourges, is it Bourges? Yeah. No, it's Rouen, bought a dispensation to eat butter during Lent, and it raised so much money for the church that they built a big tower, which is called the Butter Tower to this day. So there's other things apart from indulgences. There are also these dispensations. Oh, and let me mention Erasmus, just as on the story. Poor Erasmus goes to dinner one day at a friend of his house, Zosimus, and Zosimus knows about Erasmus's, it's during Lent, is a aversion to fish, so he has a chicken prepared for him privately. And Erasmus gets there and he goes, oh no, the guys, they cooked this especially. He feels so bad about the fact that they went out and they did this, and he would have been happy just eating vegetables. Didn't matter. That he makes an excuse and he goes home. He's so embarrassed. And someone told on Zosimus that he broke the rules, and he gets pulled before the church authorities and he gets in trouble, and Erasmus has to write this whole letter saying, this is ridiculous. And folks, where does it say you're not supposed to eat meat during Lent in the New Testament? It's not there. Okay, it's not. It was a tradition invented later. So fasting, I just want to stress this because it's obviously, as a food historian, this is very important for me. And I've been working on the topic for a long time. But it is one of those things that in popular perception is just as important as as getting out of purgatory and buying indulgences, is buying dispensations. Who can do it? Who can afford it? Who can afford to eat? In the period of Darth, when the vegetables aren't coming up yet, and you've eaten all the salami that you put away and pickled meat, and you're living on sauerkraut and beans, like we are now, if you had to buy a dispensation to buy meat, it might be worth it, right? So just keep in mind, that's part of the whole story. And in any case, these indulgences, all of a sudden there's a great campaign to build St. Peter's. The indulgence sales get stepped up all over Europe. People in England would say, the penny drops in the box and the soul flies out of purgatory. So poor people just started cashing in. I think I've done some terrible things. I don't want to spend time in purgatory later. If I pay up now, I'll get out early later. And that's how it works, because it's a good work, right? A work. One of these salesmen in particular, Johannes, what's his first name? It's Tetzel. So like pretzel, Tetzel is his name, particularly outraged Luther. And in Luther's mind, and he says this quite clearly, isn't this, in effect, buying your salvation? Isn't it kind of forcing God to do something to get you into heaven because you have paid up somehow? If you're a perfectly rotten, dreadful person but have money, you can just pay up and then get into heaven? It seems a little suspect, doesn't it? So, around this time, by tradition, Luther was, I don't know whether this is true, it's not true, but he was on the potty, straining on one particular day when he had a revelation. I know that sounds ridiculously sacrilegious, but it happens about 1516 to 17, when Luther suddenly says, wait a minute, there's no way any of us can satisfy God, not just with paying up, but the works business in general. Can it please God to go and visit the bones of Saint whoever, to go to a holy site to get cured, to all these other things considered works? Do they matter? And I imagine, in fact, that he was sitting reading the epistles of St. Paul, which most people don't do, remember, and reading a passage where it clearly says that it is not the works that save a person, but it is only faith. And Luther thinks, well, then why are we doing these works? Or it's not a matter of why are we doing them. I suppose if you had faith, you would do good things anyway. It would come out of you, flow spontaneously. But the knowledge that the works don't get you into heaven, there's no big book of brownie points there, is actually kind of empowering. It kind of makes you think, finally, I don't have to worry if I'm doing this right and that right and that right and that right. Because in fact, all people suck and we're all dreadful anyway, and we're never going to make God happy. And yet here's the wonderful thing, is you have faith. It's not something you can strive to get. You have it or you don't. If you have faith, you get forgiven anyway. Despite all the dreadful things you've done, is you are forgiven. You're given grace. Remember that. I know we're getting into sticky theological issues here, but the idea is that you can never, ever do anything to gain credit with God, except that one thing: have the faith that He is your Savior, that He will forgive you. The doctrine is called sola fide, by justification by faith alone. Those are the words you need to remember, okay? Sola means only, fide, faith, means justification. You get into heaven only because you have faith. So that really wealthy person who does dreadful things, doesn't believe in God, and pays for the indulgences, is not getting in. He's not going to heaven. You might wonder, why is Luther reading the Bible and interpreting it for himself? And, it's the same period. This is exactly when Christian humanism is flowing up, and people like Erasmus have become popular, especially where Luther gets his sort of first job is at Wittenberg. It's the University of Wittenberg in the eastern part of Germany. And people are starting to say maybe the Bible should be the sole practice, sole basis of practice. And he says, if that's the case, it's there clearly in St. Paul that says faith only gets you justified, nothing else. Those things are not bad. Doing good things is not bad, but the entire idea of buying indulgences, all the superstitions, all the things which he called, and I know this is going to sound a little distasteful to many people, he called them the laws. He called them the Jewish laws. Okay, now what that means is Judaism is a lot about rituals, performing the rituals, sometimes even if you don't know what they mean or understand. And I know Reformed Judaism would complain about that. It's not true. But in the mind of Christian people at the time, Judaism was only about laws, the Ten Commandments, the rituals, whatever, the sacrifices to start with, right? And all of those laws were superseded by the sacrifice of Jesus in place of the sacrifice of lambs on the altar in the Old Testament, and that the era of law was was replaced with the era of grace, the era of faith and forgiveness, and not needing to make sacrifices anymore, not needing to get circumcised anymore, not needing to keep kosher anymore. So that's stuff that, of course, happened 1,500 years before all of this. But in Luther's mind, and in many other people's mind, the laws had crept back in. Although they're not keeping kosher, they've got these fasting laws during Lent. Although they're not, performing ritual sacrifice, they're performing a mass, which is, you're eating the body and the blood of Christ, and it's a ritual in a language people don't understand that seems like a law again, right? So when Luther uses that term, I'm not going to deny that Luther was an anti-Semite. because I'll leave that to you to interpret your own way. But he calls them Jewish laws, okay? Thinking that a kind of Jewish legalism has recrept into Catholicism and has ignored the very plainness of the text that says that it's really faith that gets you saved and not the prayers and rituals and stuff you do, the works, okay? And again, the key that I want to point to here is the radical distinction between the Erasmians, who claim that we're all very good at heart and we can work hard to pull up our bootstraps and become good people, that it's a matter of personal effort. In Luther's mind, we are all rotten to the core. Mankind is in a race toward evil, he said. And there is nothing we can do to deserve our own salvation, to merit it, to achieve it by our own efforts. It's given to us. And once you accept that fact, you're kind of freed from doing all that stuff. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to suddenly be a bad person saying, I believe, and therefore I can do anything rotten because I'm going to get forgiven in the end. No, in fact, a believer will spontaneously, without effort, fulfill those works because they're not thinking like an accountant. They're not thinking, oh, do I have enough points? Do I have all the, how do I know? Am I going to get in heaven? What's that magic number? There is no magic number. It doesn't matter. He's not keeping an account. Is that the faith will, despite the fact that you mess up, because we all do, he's going to forgive us anyway. But the faith is the important thing. Now the question is, how do you get that faith? That's the hard part here. But it is faith alone that gets God to give you grace. So again, the implication is you don't participate in your own salvation. Isn't that kind of weird? I know, it seems strange. It's God's gift. It is something he gives us. He gives us mercy, though we don't ever deserve it. If we believe in it, then... So, in any case, let's get to the point. So, these ideas are in his head. What was typical practice in Wittenberg at the time, this is a university setting, was to nail up points of disputation for the theological faculty to argue about, okay, to just have a disputation. And the door of the church is where you put the announcements, right, in Latin, so that, tomorrow we're going to discuss the, possibility of a multiplicity of universes, whether there's an immaculate conception of Mary's mother, and these are topics which are typical, discussed in university settings among the faculty of theology. So Luther says, okay, I've got some points I want to discuss. 95 points, that's unusual, I think. But a whole mess of theses, right? Ideas that he's going to put forward in Latin on what is in effect the university bulletin board. That's 1517, okay? Inviting this scholarly disputation. No one else pays attention to this. This is among scholars, okay? And the question, the big question is really the one of indulgences. Can you buy your way into heaven? Does the church have any power to say how quickly someone's going to get out of purgatory? These are humans. How can they possibly say, you buy this piece of paper and you're going to get out of there earlier? Do they have any control over what happens after death? How can they make promises like that when ultimately your salvation depends on God's will, not that of people? And it leads ultimately to the bigger question, does not our salvation entirely depend on God's will and not our own works or our own efforts? That's the implication of this. The implication is then maybe is the church, if the rituals are not required, is the church not necessary for salvation? Is the way it's developed with its institutions and its hierarchy and its rituals, are those not required? Is maybe the connection to God a spiritual relationship that's really going to get us saved, not all the trappings of the church and its wealth and everything? So this is very dangerous stuff, okay, admittedly. And it becomes far more dangerous because someone translated it into German and someone printed these theses. and starts spreading them around. And I want you to imagine someone, ordinary person who can read, not Latin but German, suddenly looks at this pamphlet and says, the indulgences you've been paying for to the church to get you out of purgatory, they're not going to get you saved. And it says it right there in the New Testament. And the guy says, well, I haven't read that. Well, of course, no, he hasn't read that. But suddenly, and he's having trouble getting food on the table, and his family is hungry, and the church is wealthy, and they're taking my money, they're hoodwinking me, they're ripping me off. I was about to do a Bernie impersonation. I won't. He just left the... he's not a candidate anymore. But you should understand what I want you to... No. The point is that these social issues get tied up in with this feeling, and money is the issue, that the church is hoodwinking them. And the fact that this is out there, and the idea that what the church says is based on its own traditions, not on the Bible itself. So there's another concept, which let me introduce it here. There's sola fide, by scripture alone. Its counterpart is sola scriptura, only by the scriptures, meaning that if it's not in the Bible, you shouldn't do it, or it's tradition, and the Bible should be the judge of what you do and how you get saved. So all of this, of course, gets Luther in a whole great deal of trouble, and I don't need to go through the details, but the Pope hears about this, and he gets called to Rome, says, get over here, answer for these, why did you promote these ideas? They're a direct threat to the church's authority. And probably what would have happened is he would have either gone to Rome, had been forced to recant, or and if he didn't, he would have been burned, like Jan Hus a century before. No doubt about that. Okay, and it happened that the Elector Frederick of Saxony, he's the temporal ruler of that whole region, who doesn't really like the power of the emperor, who makes demands on him. Emperor is his immediate superior. Doesn't really like the fact that so much money is going beyond the mountains to Rome. But Frederick of Saxony decides he's going to protect Luther, and says, "Don't worry, you're not going to Rome. I will protect you." Again, possibly out of selfish motives to gain independence from Rome, maybe to protect his little fledgling university there in Wittenberg. There may be many, many motives, and I'm not going to speculate on why he did this, but he decided that to protect Luther, and said, yes, we will have official disputations, but these will be on German soil. You're not going to Rome. You're going to be in my territory where you will have my protection. And in the course of the next few years, Luther has a chance to sharpen his arguments, to make, and his prose can sometimes be vitriolic, admittedly, intended to stir people up. He's a very passionate writer, no doubt about that. So the disputation is going to happen anyway, okay? And this happens in 1521 at the Diet of Worms. Now you're probably wondering, how do you spell that? It's the Diet of Worms, okay? And you're all going to wonder, what do worms eat anyway? No, it's a diet, D-I-E-T, of W-O-R-M-S is the name of the city. That's 1521, where Luther comes before the princes of the empire, and Charles V is there, the emperor himself. And the question is, should we abolish indulgences because they're not in the Bible? Should the whole idea of purgatory be scrapped? Because that's not really in the Bible either. It doesn't say, there's a final judgment, but there's no waiting station that it talks about. And there are all sorts of other things that have crept into church practice over the centuries that they are wondering, should we still do this stuff? If we're going to use the scripture, what does that mean for the ultimate authority of the Pope, for his infallibility? Remember, and the conciliar movement, let me just remind you of that, is this idea that the bishops and the entire body of the church and a council has the real power to decide dogma. So what happens to that stuff that the Pope just decides, or that creeps in through tradition, that becomes, and what does it mean, for example, when the real question here, and the biggest issue among all of these, is, does that doctrine of transubstantiation that the Lateran Council in 1215 comes to, that the bread and wine become actual body and blood? It's a fly in my face. Sorry, this is my my devil trying to torture me here for blaspheming. Is that accessible? Is that admissible? It's a matter of scholastic theology. It's not in the New Testament. It's never really explained. The real presence, meaning the real actual body and blood in those, you'd have to assume Jesus was speaking literally, but maybe he wasn't. He spoke in metaphors all the time. I am the vine, I am the this and that, right? So keep that in mind. That's going to be the central issue, not just between Catholics and Lutherans, but between Lutherans and the other Protestant sects also. Where does it say that there should be a group of separate males separated into a celibate priesthood? It doesn't say that either. Where does it say that there should be a separate sacrament to ordain them, to separate them into a separate priestly class? It doesn't say that either. Aren't all people who believe worthy of being considered saints? Aren't they all truly holy people? So these are big, dangerous questions to ask. And so the Diet of Worms opens a can of worms, to speak of in ridiculous metaphors. So that not only gets Luther excommunicated, but for his own safety, he has to be kidnapped and hidden in the Wartburg castle in Saxony. And that's when he grows his beard, and he's protected by all this. So the question is, of course, where do you stop? If you're going to use the Bible only, what do you do with the relics? What do you do with the whole worship of saints? Are they idols? Because another part of the Bible says, do not bow down before graven images. So that's exactly what people are doing when they make a prayer to Saint Lucy and her eyes, or Saint Agatha who had her breast cut off, whatever it may be. Isn't that idolatry? Doesn't the book say not to do that? Of course, it's in the Old Testament, but is that not also part of the tradition? So, or not part of the text? I shouldn't say tradition. I meant the text of the Bible. And if those aren't necessary, why are we paying tithes? Okay, render unto Caesar, but this is not Caesar. This is the church organization. Why do we have to obey anything the Pope says? Why should we not have a liturgy in a language we can understand? Remember, Jesus spoke to his parishioners. They sure understood what he was saying. Why now do we have it in this weird medieval Latin? Why should the Bible not be translated into German, is the real question. And this is another thing I should mention, that Wycliffe anticipates Luther. Wycliffe in his circle, maybe even he individually, they started a translation of the Bible, which goes through Tyndale, which goes through later versions of the Bishop's Bible, which ultimately really influences the King James down the road, interestingly. So translating the Bible is never been done before, okay? And you can see also where the humanist side of the whole movement is involved here. Get a good, real working translation of these texts so we know what they really mean. But, I can think, this is kind of going to appeal to ordinary people who now say, I can be included in the liturgy. I can understand the text and read the Bible and have the whole thing happen in a language that I understand and participate in. And I think, many people, of course, still are anxious to get rid of the clerical abuses, paying church taxes, the indulgences, all that stuff. So Lutheranism catches on in a very big way in the 1520s. There's still no idea that it may constitute a permanent break with Rome, or that there will be a creation of an entirely separate church, but it's beginning to seem like that's where it's heading, because it's not going to the Pope is not going to reform on his own volition anything, so it may be may mean breaking away, but it hasn't happened yet. For the moment, the masses of ordinary people, I think, found Luther very appealing. They may have followed him out of hatred for the wealthy, for completely social reasons. And the masses are getting truly unruly. Okay. Why are the peasants so revolting? Because they don't bathe. No. So what happens in 1424 to 5 is this breaks out into a series of peasant uprisings across southern Germany. Hatred for priests and monasteries and landlords spills over into a hatred for all wealth, and this becomes a real social revolution. And I will come back to the Peasants' Up War in great detail when we talk about the Anabaptists and the Radical Reformation. But these are called Schwärmer. They're the swarming, unbathed masses, and they are put down with brutal violence. Remember, it is the state that put this Reformation in. It's magisterial. It is the state that cannot accept social revolution. And Luther is called in to support this policy. He wrote a text called Against the Murdering Thieving Hordes of Peasants, and justifies their destruction. And I want you to look, there's a stunningly terrifying triumphal column. I don't think it was ever built, but it was designed by Albrecht Dürer, the painter and an artist, which has got all these agricultural weird motifs. It's a big column, but at the very top is a peasant lying over the top with a sword through his back. Take a look at that. Stop the lecture. Look at Dürer's triumphant column against the Peasants' War. But to get back to Luther, I think, in his mind, this was a religious reformation. It was not a social revolution. It wasn't meant to despoil the wealth of good, upstanding citizens and turn peasants into revolutionaries. This was murder and violent are not appropriate means in his mind. So people who rise up should be squashed, even if it takes violence. And I think it's also clear that many peasants really didn't understand what he was talking about. Theologically, they joined in for completely selfish reasons, for other reasons, okay? But the importance of these uprisings is twofold. One is many people who were perfectly willing to back Luther in matters that were purely theological, the indulgences and so forth. They now backed off. They now said, this is dangerous stuff. We don't want any part of this. They saw what implication all of this had, that the attack on the authority of Rome was potentially an attack on all authority. So your good, upstanding citizens said, we're not going this far. We don't want to break away from Rome. We can reform and change things, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. On the other hand, it also meant that the reforms would be underdone very carefully. They would be done by the state, not by the Schwärmer, not by the ordinary people. But princes would put this in place, and that's why this is called the reform by act of state. And almost all reformations are done by states. Okay, from this point on, that's an important point to make here. We'll get to the exceptions later. And the other thing is, at this point, Germany is very divided geographically, and so at this becomes the turning point where you're now for the Pope or you're for Luther. Okay, it becomes a direct confrontation, and Luther started to change things that really were not part of the original theological debate, or they're part, but they weren't necessary to happen, but they did anyway. One is let me explain why he did these things. So much of Luther doesn't really seem to have been that interested in the church government itself, what form that took. Now that a Lutheran church is being set up, they said, okay, do we have bishops? Do we have this? Do we have the church structure? Because we don't have the Romes anymore. Do we keep everything in place? Do we reform it all? How do we govern the church, the ecclesia, the ecclesiastical structure? What do we do? And in Luther's mind, this was kind of all what he called adiaphora. meaning that's a Greek term meaning stuff that's really not so important. It's not about salvation. It's not about faith and justification. This is stuff that is just sort of human institutions that are convenient or not. We'll figure them out. And if you choose this form or that form, it doesn't really matter. There were a few things that he did insist upon. One is clerical celibacy is not going to work, folks. So let's let priests marry, like they do in the Eastern Orthodox Church. But when it comes to do we have bishops? Doesn't matter. Fine, have bishops. Do we have churches that look like they've always have? Doesn't matter. Do we get rid of the images because it's praying to idols? He says it doesn't matter. As long as people understand that that's not going to get them saved, they might help faith. Because remember, lots of people are still ignorant. If they need images to teach them, that works. It's helpful. It will be a bolster to their faith. There's nothing inherently bad about them. What's bad is promising people to get into heaven by using those. But otherwise, we don't have to destroy them. So Catherine, I'm reading my notes. So priests do marry. And in fact, there's a very funny story. Luther and his buddies, a bunch of other monks, meet this group of nuns, and they all start pairing off and marrying. They say, okay, I guess I'll marry you, and I'll marry you, and they get to Luther last, because Luther's not, I won't say anything, but they're down to Luther and the very last nun, Catherine von Bora, and take a look at her. So there's portraits, wonderful portraits by Lucas Cranach, who becomes the kind of court painter of the early Lutheran Church. So stop and look at the portraits of Luther by Cranach and of Catherine von Bora. They're homely people, but that's the whole point. They're ordinary, good, honestly ugly people. So they get married. That's the first thing. Which, although it's not, I don't know. That doesn't fit into that larger category of adiaphora. I think this is something he just thought. It's not necessary for priests to be celibate, and it probably causes more problems than it solves. So some states within Germany stayed loyal to Rome, others started siding with Luther, and the Protestant Reformation, the protest itself, doesn't really happen until 1529 at the Diet of Speyer. Speyer is a city also, where they officially submit a protest to the papacy, and that's where the word Protestant comes from. Okay? Luther's 95 Theses were not a protest. This is the official one, and it comes from a state, and the separate, Lutheran Church emerging suddenly realizes that if they're going to survive, they have to have a military arm. They have to have force to defend them should the forces of the Pope come to, or the Emperor, of course, is the greater threat. So they form an alliance system, what's called the Schmalkaldic League. It's spelled actually just like it sounds weirdly, Schmalkaldic, Schmalkaldic, which is a new political force in Europe that includes Saxony, of course. It includes Hesse, which is, I guess, to the northeast of there. It includes Braunschweig or Brunswick, about 20 cities. Brandenburg and Prussia later joins, which is a big, powerful Eastern Germany. What they settled on at this point really becomes becomes Lutheranism as a new sect of Christianity. One decisive break with Rome. Okay, that's the important thing. The Pope and the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy are abandoned. Number two, as we said, nuns and monks are freed from their burdensome vows, and Luther himself gets married, and clerical celibacy is abolished. Okay. Number three, selling church offices. This whole idea that you can buy a position and gain money on it, that is abolished. Church funds, the idea is that money should go for the care of the parish rather than ecclesiastical baubles and paintings and other such things. And most importantly, I think the Bible should be available to all people in their own language, and the parishioners should be educated so as to be able to read it. And weirdly, so the German that Luther puts the Bible in, very common working, ordinary kind of German, very Saxon Germany, Lower Saxon in many ways, becomes the standard German, becomes the uniform language of Germany in the long run. The dialect that he speaks, the way words are spelled, the many other dialects, they don't disappear. I mean, you go to Switzerland, they speak something totally different, even though they claim it's German. But the fact that people will read the book in German, that makes it becomes the standard German language. And priests become a little bit more like teachers and preachers. And although the church itself, they don't destroy the older churches, the new ones that are built are kind of like, they're big halls, big open halls where people can, in fact, they're called hall churches, where the congregants can all actually see the person performing the, it's not exactly the same kind of mass, but the rituals they can see and participate. Well, I'll talk about in a second how. And there's a new kind of design for churches. I guess this is anticipated by, I'm trying to think of one built in Luther's day, Wolfenbüttel. The church there is very Mannerist in some ways, but it's designed with this big open hall design. I spent a summer once there in Wolfenbüttel, which is a great place, even though everything smells like Jägermeister, because the factory is actually there. So it's just like you smell these enriched herbs all the time. But anyway, the cathedral in Wolfenbüttel is an early Lutheran church designed along those lines. But the most important thing is that Luther starts writing songs in German for the congregation to sing, to participate. It's not just a couple of clergymen, singing the chant, or professional singers. Everyone sings this. And if you've ever heard, the hymn, a hymn is a non-biblical song of worship. If you've ever heard Ein Festburg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God, Luther wrote that. So he wrote the music. This idea that you should have good popular songs, everyone joins in and sings along. And I contend that we see, in the wake of Lutheranism, Germany becomes the premier place for music and musicians. To this day, very musically oriented. And I think why? It's because people have to learn not just to read German, to read music, so they can sing these hymns in the church. Is that everyone can read music, everyone learns an instrument, the choral music, the sung mass, everything. You wonder where Bach and ultimately Beethoven and everyone comes out of. It's this German musical tradition that I think is connected to Lutheranism and the singing in church. Okay? And then theologically, of course, justification by faith, a set of things you believe. Remember, from practices to beliefs to creeds, that's most important. The external acts are de-emphasized, the rituals, and the inner belief is emphasized. The things you do that gets you saved, the creed, the worship, in fact, even an idea which is a beruf, a calling, that somehow you get this calling. I don't know why that just suddenly popped into my head, but and then also the sacraments are reduced to baptism. Keep this in mind because it'll be important later. To penance, or the confession, right, to getting forgiven from your sins, and the Eucharist itself, okay, getting saved by the. But what's actually happening in there, Luther's not quite sure yet. We'll come to that in a second. But as far as the church government is concerned, again, Luther doesn't really care much about that. Adiaphora. Whether you have bishops, whether you have vestments, whether you have a physical structure, let's just leave that up to the secular authorities. Let them decide what they want. And the rulers, of course, reform as they like, and if you don't like it, you go somewhere else. This is called the jus reformandi, the right, every ruler has a right to reform and figure out those little details for themselves. And if you don't like it, the jus emigrandi, go somewhere else. If you don't like the way they're doing it in your town, move. that's your choice. So let's look into a little bit more into Luther's theology. I don't know where we are time-wise, but let's just keep going. So the most important text which I would have you read is called The Freedom of a Christian Man. That's written in 1520, where Luther is forced to clarify what he means by the works don't gain you salvation. That we, the idea is that even though we keep failing, God will forgive us as long as we have faith. That's kind of the most accessible text to get into, and the classic one. And I think he addresses this question, well, doesn't it then give you an open invitation to forget good works entirely, even doing good things for other people or being nice? So aren't we enticed to forget about morality if suddenly we know we're going to get saved anyway, just all we have to have is faith? And he would, and so this is really, again, the dividing line between the Erasmians and the Lutherans. The Erasmians say, well, you can't get rid of free will. You can't get rid of this idea that we work to do good things, we strive to improve ourselves, and that God cares about that. Whether he has an account book or not is irrelevant. It's good. He wants us to do those things. And the Erasmian would say, if you suddenly take away this idea of free will, then people are just going to do whatever they want. They're going to say, if God's already decided if I'm saved or not, if I have faith, if he's given it to me, then who cares? I'll be a dreadful person. And if I don't participate in my salvation, very clearly I don't have faith, so I'm obviously going to hell. So who cares? Let's live it up. Let's do dreadful things. Who cares? So this is what I think the question he has to answer. And it's a thorny one, and he doesn't go the full 9 yards, which is what Calvin does, to say that we are predestined, that our salvation is totally out of our hands, and he doesn't want us to abandon the works. He said, it's sort of like, if you have faith, that's the watering of the tree that will eventually bear fruit. That's the good works that are just going to come naturally from you, but it's not going to be the stuff like fasting and praying to saints and stuff. It's going to be good works. It's actually going to be helping other people, giving charity, help, and that's just going to come because if you have faith, it just will happen because you're going to care about people, and you're saved, and you know that there's no accounting of all these little things you do, so you'll do them out of the goodness of your heart. Some theologians will say, no, that's not going to ever happen. Sorry. And so the question for, the humanists, of course, their goal is improving morals. It's not Luther's goal. And Luther says we're all rotten anyway. It doesn't matter. What he wants is for us to be saved, to get into heaven. He says that we have to look at the many different kinds of law. Laws being things that we must do. Obviously, the Old Testament's filled with laws that God gave Moses for the Hebrews, the 10 Commandments and the ritual law and the sacrifices. I've spoke about this already, but this is the book where he talks about this stuff, and that we should now that there's a New Testament, because Christ was sacrificed, Good Friday tomorrow, then we are free. And this is the word that I want to introduce here, real freedom. And the freedom of a Christian man is the text where he talks about this, is not the freedom to work hard and earn salvation, but it's the freedom to know that if you have faith, you're going to be saved anyway. Don't worry about it. And that the kind of, Christ is the end of the law, that everyone who has faith may be justified. I thought I'd just throw in a quote there to give you a little taste of him. And that Christianity in itself has a promise of forgiveness if you look at the Gospels themselves. If you read the original texts, the Roman Catholic Church, they got misguided. They put the altars back. They created a ritual priesthood like the Levites. They built a sacred temple, which is, St. Peter's being built again. And they prescribe sacraments that people must do for their salvation. And the point is, he's saying this is not in the Bible. We should follow the example of the primitive church of believers, and once again imitate them. Now again, Luther doesn't go so far with this. Do they really imitate Jesus? Do they give away all their wealth? No, because the state puts in Lutheranism. They're not going to give up the wealth. Do they, wander around begging? No. Do they take the things that he said literally? Like if someone hits you, what do? You turn the other cheek. That implies pacifism. Do they do that? Well, of course not. They've just killed the peasants, right? Used violence. So I want you to keep in mind that the constraints of being put in by a very conservative kind of state means that they can't follow through logically all the implications of the doctrine of sola scriptura, living by the text alone, and they can't, in many respects, go so far as the sola fide either, because again, this big question is, how do you get faith? What if I'm not sure? Does that mean I don't have faith, or does it mean I do? Is it only a few people? Is it everyone? Well, it doesn't seem fair if only some people are given this faith and everyone else has to go to hell. That doesn't seem fair. Why would God do that to us? That doesn't seem fair at all. And so these are the questions that are in other people's minds. And let me also mention the question, which we'll come back to this, of the real presence. Is that bread really turning into the flesh and the blood, the wine into blood? Luther, in the end, says yes, it does really happen. It's not transubstantiation. It doesn't change. He comes up with a doctrine called consubstantiation, which means that, yes, it still looks and tastes like bread. It's not just the accidents. This is not just some weird thing on the outside, but the essence being bread. But it is bread and its flesh. It is wine and its blood. So the substance, it's both of them. It's a very weird Aristotelian logic chopping, which we'll see no other Protestant church is going to go that way. They're going to take the route that it is a memorial. Because that's what he says. When you eat of the bread and drink of the wine, remember me. That's what happens on Passover, which was last night. So very interesting timing for all this stuff. So I think I'm going to just leave you with that, and leave you to one more point, is that where the Erasmians insist on free will, everyone being able to ultimately really save themselves, Luther writes a text called The Bondage of the Will, meaning we don't have the choice, we don't participate in our salvation, we are faithful or we're not. And it is where the two part ways. Erasmus says, I'm sticking with the Catholic Church and I'm sticking with my good humanist free will, and because your bondage of the will not make anyone better. You may call it freedom, you may call it the true freedom of a Christian, but in fact it doesn't include most people, and it's going to alienate them. Now that's the humanist's mind. Now what's really kind of interesting is Luther's right-hand man, Melanchthon, is a humanist, writes a lot of the Lutheran tracts. I think he's the one who writes up the creed, in fact, for the Lutheran Church, and he's the one who's sent to discuss all this stuff with the other Protestants, we'll talk about next time. And Melanchthon is kind of, he's far more intellectual and far more interesting as a theologian. He cannot bridge that gap over the meaning of the Eucharist. He tries really hard, and you got to give him credit for that, but Luther sticks to this idea that it's got to still be a real presence. So what we're going to do next time is almost the same time as Luther. There's also a Reformation in Switzerland, just a couple of years later, which is in many ways more influential. Well, I shouldn't say that. The Lutheranism, obviously, for northern Germany, for the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, are Lutheran also. But it doesn't go beyond that. The kind of Protestantism that catches on almost everywhere else will be the Swiss Reform, and will be ultimately Calvinism. He's not there at the very beginning, but other figures are. And we shall turn to them next time, to the Swiss Reformation.